I was 4 years old the last time my mother recognized me. The memory exists in fragments now. Sharp pieces of glass buried so deep in my mind that touching them still draws blood after all these years. She was kneeling in our HAB unit, the one with walls so thin you could hear prayers from 3 compartments away, and her hands were shaking as she pressed a data slate against my chest. The room smelled like the promethium heaters we weren't supposed to run during day shift, that acrid chemical warmth that made your eyes water if you breathed too deeply. Her fingers were calloused from assembly work, the same work she'd done for 16 years in Manufacturum 7 Theta, and when she spoke her voice carried the hoarse quality of someone who'd screamed themselves empty and was now operating on the dregs of whatever strength remained. "Torin," she said, using my name for what I didn't know would be the last time she'd ever speak it. "No matter what happens, no matter what they make us, remember that we loved you. Remember that we tried." My father stood in the doorway, his silhouette backlit by the sodium lamps in the corridor beyond. He was a broad man, built from years of hauling load crates in the transit yards, and his shadow swallowed most of the room. I remember thinking he looked like the statues of imperial saints in the shrine alcoves, monumental and immovable. But when I looked closer, I could see his jaw working like he was chewing through words that refused to come out properly. The air tasted like machine oil and the recycled breath of 10,000 workers, metallic and stale, and somewhere in the lower levels a manufacturing bell was tolling the shift change with deep bronze notes that made the walls vibrate. 3 hours later, the Mechanicus provosts came through our door with maglock cutters and void-sealed warrants. I learned later what tax fraud meant in the context of Forge World Natalica. How my parents had underreported their tithe by 17.3% over a period of 8 months, diverting those credits toward medical supplies I needed after I contracted manufactory lung from breathing too much aerosolized metal dust. The trial lasted 90 seconds. The sentence was read in binary cant by a robed tech adept whose optical implants glowed red in the dim light of our HAB. Servitor conversion. Immediate implementation. No appeals. The Emperor's mercy expressed through eternal service to the Omnissiah's glory. They took my parents that night. I watched from the corridor as Skitarii in rust-red armor guided them toward the Medicae facilities in the Forge Temple's eastern quarter, where conversion surgeries took place in chambers blessed by machine oils and the endless hymns of the priesthood. My mother looked back once. Her eyes found mine through the crowd of gathered workers, and in that moment I saw something collapse inside her, some fundamental architecture of hope crumbling into rubble. Then a Skitari's augmetic hand turned her face forward, and she disappeared into corridors that smelled like disinfectant and burning bone. If the weight of knowing what comes next already presses against your chest, leave the word "witnessed" in the comments below. Let them know someone remembers the moment they stopped being human. The orphan halls of Metallica are not buildings so much as they are processing facilities for human raw material. They occupy the tertiary levels of Manufacturum Complex Gamma, vast spaces carved from the Forge world's bedrock where children whose parents have been executed, conscripted, or converted are housed in dormitories that hold 200 souls per chamber. The walls are bare rockcrete, gray as ash and cold enough in the night cycles that frost forms in geometric patterns along the ceiling vents. We slept on pallets of compressed synthetic fiber, arranged in neat rows that allowed the overseers to count us during the hourly attendance verifications. The air smelled perpetually of antiseptic solution, and the particular sourness of too many bodies confined in insufficient space, a smell that gets inside your clothes and skin until you stop noticing it because it becomes part of your identity. I arrived at Orphan Hall 17 on the 3rd day after my parents' conversion, carrying nothing because we'd owned nothing worth taking. The other children had learned not to ask questions about new arrivals. In the Imperium's industrial worlds, orphans are a renewable resource, generated at predictable rates through predictable causes. You arrive, you are processed, you are assigned a bunk and a duty roster. and then you become part of the machine that grinds children into workers with the same efficiency it grinds ore into refined metals. The overseers were tech thralls mostly, humans who'd taken partial augmentation in service to the Mechanicus, but retained enough organic cognitive function to manage basic supervisory tasks. They spoke in flat, emotionless tones, and their eyes had the glassy quality of people who'd been conditioned not to see individuals anymore, only productivity metrics and compliance percentages. My bunk was in the northeast corner of Chamber 7, position 193 out of 200. The boy in position 194 was named Kale. He was 6 years old, thin as stripped wire, and had been in the orphan holes since infancy, after his mother died in a press forge accident. He taught me the essential survival skills during those first months. How to eat the nutrient paste they served in the refectory without tasting it, by placing each spoonful far back on your tongue and swallowing immediately. How to recognize when the overseers were conducting random inspections versus scheduled ones, so you knew which contraband items needed to be hidden versus which could remain in your footlocker. How to pray the litany of the machine during morning devotions, without actually thinking about the words, letting them flow through your mouth, while your mind went somewhere else. Somewhere that didn't have walls and work quotas and the constant grinding hum of machinery in the levels below. Education in the orphan halls was practical and brutal. We learned to read technical schematics before we learned to read Gothic script. We learned the proper prayers for blessing machine spirits before we learned arithmetic. By age 6, I could identify 70 different types of fasteners by sight and correctly calculate the torque specifications for most standard assembly applications. By age 7, I could recite the Catechism of the Omniscia in both Low Gothic and binary cant, though I understood neither. The overseers drilled information into us with the same methodology used to program servitors, through repetition and punishment, building neural pathways through sheer grinding persistence until knowledge became reflex and reflex became identity. 3 times per week, we were marched to the viewing galleries that overlooked Manufacturum 7 Theta. This was called vocational orientation, though its true purpose was obvious even to children. The galleries were observation platforms suspended above the production floors, enclosed in armored glass that muted the worst of the noise, but couldn't stop the heat from rising through the gratings beneath our feet. We would stand there for hours, watching the workers below tend to assembly lines that stretched away into hazy distance. Kilometer-long rivers of components flowing through stations where human hands and augmetic tools shaped raw materials into finished products, according to patterns that had been holy since before the Emperor walked among men. The servitors were impossible not to notice. They moved through the Manufacturum in predictable patterns, shambling between duty stations with the characteristic jerking gait that comes from having your motor cortex rewired to accept external commands. Most were loading servitors, their bodies augmented with hydraulic lifting gear and cargo harnesses that made them look like insects that had been partially crushed and then rebuilt wrong. They would collect finished component crates from assembly stations, transport them to shipping platforms, and then return to collect more crates in an endless cycle that continued through all 3 daily shifts. Their faces, what remained of them behind the augmetic implants and control sockets, held no expression whatsoever, just empty meat wrapped around machinery, biological components performing mechanical functions. I started looking for my parents during the 2nd month. The overseers said it was pointless, that identifying individual servitors was both impossible and irrelevant, that a servitor has no more personal identity than a screwdriver or a cutting torch. But I looked anyway. I memorized the duty roster numbers stenciled on their work harnesses. I learned the shift patterns, which servitors operated during which hours and in which sectors. I studied their augmentation patterns, because even though the Mechanicus followed standardized conversion protocols, minor variations existed based on the servitor's designated function and the particular forge temple that performed the surgery. It took me 3 months to find my father. He was working the cargo platforms in Sector 7 Theta 9, approximately 200 meters from where my mother had operated her assembly station before the conversion. His designation was Servitor Unit L479 Kappa. They'd removed most of his scalp to install the control socket assembly, a ring of burnished steel that encircled his skull like a crown of thorns. His shoulders had been surgically broadened to accommodate the hydraulic lifting gear bolted to his spine, and his arms terminated in simple grasping claws rather than hands. But I recognized his face, what remained of it, the shape of his jaw, the scar above his left eye from where he'd been struck by a loading chain 5 years before I was born. The particular way his left eyebrow had always been slightly higher than his right, giving him a perpetual expression of mild skepticism that used to make my mother laugh during the evening meals we'd share in our hab unit. That expression was gone now. His face held nothing at all. He stood at his duty station, responding to command impulses transmitted through the Forge Temple's central control system, lifting crates that weighed 400 kilograms as easily as a man lifting a cup of recaf. His eyes, still organic because optical systems weren't necessary for his designated function, stared straight ahead with the blank fixation of someone whose visual cortex has been partially excised. I watched him for the entire 2-hour observation period. He never looked up, never paused, never showed any indication that consciousness remained inside the meat shell that wore his face. My mother took longer to locate. She'd been converted to an assembly servitor rather than a loading unit, which meant her conversion had been less extensive but more precise. They'd left more of her cerebral cortex intact because assembly work requires fine motor control and the ability to recognize component variations, functions that can't be easily replicated with pure machinery. Her designation was Servitor Unit A834 Sigma. She operated at Station 14 in sub-level Gamma, performing wire harness assembly for atmospheric recycler components. Her hands were mostly intact, augmented with precision tool implants, where her fingers had been, and her eyes had been replaced with multispectrum optical units that could see variations in component quality invisible to baseline human vision. I found her during a gallery observation in my 8th month at the orphan halls. She was bent over her workstation, her movements precise and rhythmic as she attached micro-connectors to circuit boards with the tireless efficiency that comes from having all notions of fatigue surgically removed from your nervous system. Her hair was gone, sacrificed to make room for the dataport assembly that now occupied most of the left side of her skull. Her face, thinner than I remembered and marked with the characteristic pallor of someone whose blood has been partially replaced with oxygenated synthetic fluid, showed the same absolute emptiness I'd seen in my father. No recognition, no awareness, just function, endless and perfect, and utterly devoid of anything that could be called human. I started visiting the galleries every chance I could. The overseers permitted this, even encouraged it as part of our vocational preparation. I would stand at the armored glass for hours, watching my parents move through their duties with machine precision. My father lifting crates in Sector 9, my mother assembling components at Station 14. Both of them operating in close proximity to each other, perhaps 50 meters apart across the manufacturing floor. Close enough that if they'd still been human, they could have called to each other across that distance. But servitors don't call to each other. They don't speak at all unless their function requires verbal communication, and loading servitors and assembly servitors have no reason to interact in any way. Cale warned me that I was developing an obsession. He'd seen it before, he said, in other orphans who'd had parents converted. It never ended well. The best thing was to forget, to accept that the people who'd raised you were gone as completely as if they'd died, that the servitors wearing their faces were just machinery shaped like them but containing nothing of what they'd been. He meant well. He was trying to help, but he didn't understand that forgetting wasn't an option, that even if I could somehow excise those memories from my mind, I would still know they were down there on the manufacturing floor. Still functioning, still serving, still trapped in bodies that had been mutilated into tools. The nightmares started around my 9th year. I would dream that I was on the manufacturing floor, standing between my parents as they worked, screaming their names while they continued their duties without acknowledging my existence. Or I would dream that I was being strapped to a conversion table, that robed tech priests were leaning over me with surgical tools blessed in sacred oils, while I begged them to stop, while I promised I would be good. I would never commit any crime. I would serve the Emperor faithfully if they would just let me remain human. I would wake gasping, my palate soaked with sweat that smelled like the antiseptic solution they used to clean the dormitory floors, and lie there in the darkness listening to 200 other orphans breathing and occasionally weeping and wondering how many of them were having similar dreams. By age 10, I'd been assigned preliminary work duties in addition to our educational requirements. This was standard practice. Orphans began productive labor as soon as they possessed sufficient strength and coordination, starting with simple tasks that required minimal training. I was assigned to maintenance detail in Manufactorum 7 Theta, the same complex where my parents served as servitors. The overseers said it was coincidence. I knew better. The Mechanicus understood the value of psychological conditioning, of breaking down resistance through exposure to inevitable horror until that horror became normal and normalized became accepted and acceptance became willing participation in your own dehumanization. If knowing that children are trained by forcing them to maintain the machinery their parents have become fills you with rage, press like. Show them someone refuses to accept this as normal. My initial duties involved basic cleaning and minor repairs on the lower-tier machinery. I would spend 4 hours each day after educational sessions scrubbing coolant lines, replacing worn drive belts, applying blessed oils to gear assemblies, and performing the endless small maintenance tasks that kept the manufactorum functioning. The work was mind-numbing and physically exhausting, and the environment was a sensory assault that never resented. The heat rising from the machinery below made the air thick enough to taste, heavy with metallic particulates that coated your throat and lungs with fine grit. The noise was a constant roar composed of 10,000 individual mechanical sounds layered into a wall of force that made coherent thought difficult and conversation nearly impossible. The smell was promethium exhaust and hot metal, and the particular sharp tang of ozone generated by the massive electrical systems that powered the assembly lines. All of it undercut by the organic smell of the human workers who labored in that hell and the servitors who functioned there without complaint because they'd been surgically denied the capacity for complaint. I saw my parents every day. My father's loading route took him past my duty station approximately 12 times per shift. He would shamble by with a crate of components secured in his cargo harness, hydraulic systems hissing and wheezing with each step, his face pointed straight ahead and empty as a skull. My mother's assembly station was visible from the maintenance catwalk where I performed coolant line inspections. She would be there throughout my entire shift, bent over her workbench, her augmented hands moving with inhuman speed and precision as they assembled wire harnesses according to patterns she no longer understood because understanding had been cut out of her to make room for pure execution. The first time I spoke to them was 3 weeks into my maintenance assignment. I was replacing a worn drive belt on a conveyor motor near my father's loading station, and he was waiting there for the next component crate to be cycled onto his platform. I looked up at him, this thing that wore my father's face and body but contained nothing I could recognize as him, and heard myself say his name. Davin. Just that. His actual name, the one the Mechanicus had deleted from all official records when they'd assigned him his servitor designation. He didn't react. His eyes stared at the loading platform with absolute fixation. His chest rose and fell with mechanical regularity, each breath precisely timed according to optimal oxygen utilization protocols programmed into his augmented respiratory system. A thin line of drool leaked from the corner of his mouth because his autonomic nervous system no longer managed saliva production properly. And it caught the sodium lamplight and glistened as it ran down his chin and dripped onto the cargo harness bolted to his torso. I tried again. Louder this time, almost shouting to be heard over the manufactorum's din. Davin, it's me, it's Torin, it's your son. Nothing. No response. Not even a flicker of his eyes to indicate he'd heard anything at all. A tech thrall overseer noticed me shouting and struck me across the shoulders with his control rod, the impact sharp enough to make my teeth click together. Maintain silence during duty hours, he said in that flat, emotionless tone they all used. Servitors do not respond to verbal input except approved command phrases. Wasting time attempting communication with machinery will be logged as productivity deviation. I learned to stop speaking after that, but I never stopped watching. Every day I would see them, my father hauling his endless crates and my mother assembling her endless components. And every day I would try to find some trace of who they'd been, underneath the machinery and the surgical alterations and the behavior programming. Sometimes I thought I saw something, a hesitation in my father's movements, a pause that lasted just slightly longer than optimal efficiency would require. A moment when my mother's augmented eyes seemed to focus on something beyond her workstation, as if some fragment of consciousness was trying to surface through the layers of conditioning and neural modification that kept her functioning as a tool. But I was probably imagining it. The tech priests who performed servitor conversions were thorough. They understood human neurology better than any Medicaid, knew exactly which portions of the brain could be destroyed or reprogrammed without impairing the servitor's designated function. My parents weren't sleeping or unconscious. They were gone. What remained were biological components operating in accordance with programmed parameters. As much my parents as a rifle is the iron ore it was smelted from. The years ground past with the same relentless mechanical rhythm as the manufactorum itself. I grew taller, my body adapting to the constant physical labor and insufficient nutrition in the way bodies do when they have no choice. My hands became calloused and scarred from handling blessed machinery, whose machine spirits sometimes objected to maintenance with minor electrical discharges. My lungs adapted to the particulate heavy air, developing the thick, productive cough that every manufacturing worker eventually acquires and carries until the day they die or are converted into servitors who no longer need to breathe efficiently. My mind developed the particular numbness that comes from exposure to unrelenting horror, building psychological calluses that let me function in an environment that should have driven me mad. By age 13, I'd been promoted to minor repair duties. This was a significant advancement. Minor repairs required basic technical knowledge and the ability to diagnose simple mechanical failures, skills that marked you as more valuable than basic laborers who could only clean and haul. I learned to read diagnostic readouts on machine spirit monitors. I learned to identify component failures through subtle changes in sound or vibration. I learned the prayers and rituals necessary to perform maintenance on blessed machinery without angering the spirits that dwelt within. The precise way to apply sacred oils and the correct intonation for the litany of ignition, and the proper method for requesting forgiveness from a machine whose function you needed to interrupt. I also learned, though this was never part of any official training, how to perform basic maintenance on servitors. They broke down regularly, as any machinery does when subjected to constant use in harsh environments. Hydraulic seals would fail, leaving them unable to lift their designated loads. Locomotor systems would malfunction, causing them to stumble or freeze in place. Control socket connections would corrode, leaving them unable to receive command impulses from the central system. When this happened, they would simply stop functioning and stand motionless at their duty stations until a tech thrall or junior tech priest could be summoned to perform repairs. Often, especially during high production periods, the tech priests were too busy with critical machinery repairs to attend to malfunctioning servitors immediately. So maintenance workers like myself were taught basic servitor repair procedures, how to clear a blocked hydraulic line, how to reset a frozen locomotor system, how to clean and reseal a corroded control socket. Nothing complex, nothing that required actual technical expertise, just enough to get a malfunctioning servitor back into service without waiting for proper mechanicus personnel. The first time I performed maintenance on my father, I was 14 years old. His hydraulic lifting system had developed a leak in one of the primary pressure lines, leaving him frozen at his loading station with a 400-kilogram crate suspended in his cargo harness. The oversight tech thrall scanned the duty roster, so I was certified for basic servitor maintenance and ordered me to perform the repair. Standard procedure. Routine maintenance. the kind of task I'd performed hundreds of times on other servitors throughout the manufactorum. I stood there for perhaps 15 seconds, staring at this thing that had my father's face, trying to process what I'd just been ordered to do. The tech thrall's optical implants focused on me with mechanical precision. "Compliance delay detected," he said in that dead voice. "State reason for productivity deviation." I couldn't state a reason, because there was no reason that made sense in the context of the manufacturum's operational requirements. Servitor Unit L479 Kappa required maintenance. I was a certified maintenance worker. Personal history was irrelevant. Function was all that mattered. I performed the repair. It took approximately 20 minutes to locate the leak, seal it with blessed pressure tape, and refill the hydraulic system from the maintenance reservoir I carried on my tool belt. The entire time I worked, I was close enough to smell him. Not the person he'd been, but the servitor he'd become. That particular smell of human flesh that's been augmented with machinery. A mixture of organic decay and machine oil, and the acrid sharpness of the chemical preservatives they inject into servitor tissues to slow degradation. His face was inches from mine as I worked on the hydraulic assembly bolted to his spine. His eyes stared past me at nothing. His breathing, regulated by augmented respiratory systems, moved air past my face with mechanical regularity. When I finished the repair and stepped back, the tech thrall transmitted the activation command through his control unit. My father's hydraulic systems pressurized with the hiss of compressed fluid. His locomotor system engaged. He turned 90 degrees to his right with precise mechanical timing, carried the crate to its designated destination, and returned to his loading station to await the next crate. The entire interaction had taken 23 minutes. He never looked at me. Never gave any indication that anything had occurred beyond a routine maintenance intervention on a malfunctioning tool. Do you understand yet what the Imperium does to families? Comment where you're watching from, so others might learn what citizenship really costs. The repairs became more frequent after that. Servitors operating in harsh manufacturing environments break down constantly, their biological components degrading under the stress of continuous labor, and their mechanical augmentations requiring regular maintenance like any other machinery. I learned to recognize the specific failure patterns of different servitor types. Loading servitors developed hydraulic problems and locomotor failures. Assembly servitors suffered from fine motor control degradation and optical system malfunctions. Processing servitors, who worked in the hottest areas where raw materials were refined, had persistent cooling system failures and accelerated tissue necrosis in their remaining organic components. My father required maintenance approximately once every 3 weeks. Hydraulic seal replacements mostly, but also periodic cleaning of his control socket contacts and replacement of the nutrient feed line that supplied his reduced digestive system with the minimum sustenance necessary to keep his biological components functional. I performed these repairs with the same mechanical efficiency I applied to maintaining conveyor belts and gear assemblies. I learned to not think about whose body I was working on, to see only systems that required adjustment and components that needed replacement. To let my hands move through practiced procedures while my mind went somewhere else where fathers weren't tools and children weren't their maintenance technicians. My mother's malfunctions were different. Assembly servitors require more intact cognitive function than loading units, which means their conversions are less extensive, but their failure modes are more subtle and more difficult to repair. She would sometimes freeze in the middle of her assembly sequence, her augmented hands hovering over her workstation while her multi-spectrum eyes stared at components she could no longer process. Or she would begin repeating a single action endlessly, attaching the same connector to the same contact point over and over, until her productivity metrics dropped below acceptable parameters and an overseer had to intervene. The tech priests said these were programming errors, glitches in the behavioral conditioning that kept her functioning. They would perform soft resets, uploading corrected instruction sets through her data port and reinitializing her task parameters. Usually this worked. Sometimes it didn't. When it didn't, they would perform more invasive interventions. opening her skull to access the control modules embedded in her brain tissue, and manually adjusting the settings on systems that regulated everything from motor control to emotional suppression to pain response. I watched one of these procedures when I was 15. A tech priest named Magos Kelvin was performing the adjustment, and he permitted me to observe because he believed observation was valuable educational experience for potential future menials who might be elevated to junior tech priest status. He opened my mother's cranial access port with practiced efficiency, exposing the mass of wiring and circuit boards that had been installed where portions of her brain used to be. He made his adjustments while explaining the theory behind each one. This module controlled fine motor coordination. This one regulated chemical stress responses. This one suppressed residual personality fragments that sometimes interfered with optimal function. Servitor conversions are never perfect, he explained while his manipulator arms made delicate adjustments to components embedded in my mother's exposed brain. Some organic neural tissue remains, particularly in units requiring cognitive function beyond simple physical labor. Occasionally, these organic remnants generate what could be described as consciousness artifacts, fragments of pre-conversion personality attempting to reassert themselves through whatever neural pathways remain intact. These artifacts must be suppressed, or the servitor's efficiency degrades. He pointed to a specific module, a small circuit board with organic neural tissue grafted directly to its surface. This unit monitors for consciousness artifacts and applies corrective stimulus when they're detected. Essentially, whenever her brain attempts to remember who she was, this device administers a mild electrical shock to discourage that neural pathway from reinforcing. Over time, the pathways atrophy and the artifacts cease. It's similar to training an animal, really. Punishment for unwanted behavior until the behavior no longer occurs. I listened to this explanation while staring at what remained of my mother's brain, at the machinery threaded through organic tissue like parasites that had hollowed out their host and were now wearing its skin, and understood with complete clarity that whatever she'd been was not sleeping or waiting to be rescued. She was destroyed, thoroughly and permanently destroyed. The servitor that wore her face and body wasn't a prison she was trapped inside. It was her grave, and she was being forced to dig it deeper every day she continued functioning. My mother's servitor body began failing catastrophically when I was 16 years old. This was actually impressive longevity. Most servitors have operational lifespans of 10 to 15 years before accumulated damage and biological degradation make them uneconomical to repair. She'd been converted 12 years earlier, which meant she'd exceeded expected service duration by approximately 2 years. The Mechanicus considered this a success, a positive outcome, evidence of quality conversion work and proper ongoing maintenance. The failure manifested gradually, then suddenly, the way structural collapses do. Her fine motor control began degrading, causing her to damage components she was supposed to be assembling. Her optical system started malfunctioning, displaying error codes that indicated hardware failure in the augmented visual cortex that processed what her mechanical eyes saw. Her locomotor system became unreliable, causing her to stumble or freeze randomly during transitions between workstations. The tech priests performed repeated repairs, replacing failing components and recalibrating systems, but they were fighting basic biology. Her organic tissues were dying, cells breaking down under accumulated radiation exposure and chemical stress and the simple grinding wear of being used as machinery for over a decade. The final breakdown occurred during a night shift in winter month 7 of Imperial Year 341.M41. I wasn't present when it happened, but I heard about it from other maintenance workers. She'd been in the middle of an assembly sequence when multiple systems failed simultaneously. Her optical processors shut down, leaving her effectively blind. Her motor control systems locked, freezing her in position. Her respiratory augmentation malfunctioned, causing her to suffocate slowly while standing motionless at her workstation. The tech thrall overseers noted the productivity deviation and logged it for repair, but by the time a tech priest arrived to diagnose the failure, her biological components had been without oxygen for approximately 8 minutes. Severe brain damage. Total system failure. Unit no longer salvageable for continued service. The work order came through standard channels. Servitor Unit A834 Sigma. Terminal failure. Transport to recycling facility for component reclamation. I saw it on my duty roster along with 3 other routine tasks. Replace worn drive belt on Conveyor 7. Recalibrate pressure sensors in Sector 12. Transport failed servitor to recycling. Standard maintenance operations. Nothing special. Nothing that required any particular emotional response. The overseer who gave me the assignment didn't know, or more likely didn't care, that the failed servitor had been my mother. Personal history wasn't tracked in maintenance rosters. Servitors were machinery, maintenance workers were functionaries. The fact that I'd been assigned to transport the corpse of the woman who'd given birth to me was coincidence. Or perhaps deliberate cruelty disguised as coincidence. Or perhaps there was no difference between those two things in a system that had been designed from the beginning to grind human beings into components and feel nothing about doing so. I found her still at her workstation. They'd removed her from the assembly line itself because a non-functional servitor disrupted workflow, but they'd left her slumped against a support pillar because corpse removal wasn't a high-priority task. She'd been there for approximately 6 hours, cooling in the ambient heat of the manufactorum, her augmented body settling into the stillness that comes when mechanical systems shut down and biological processes cease. Her multispectrum eyes, no longer powered, had faded to dull gray. Her mouth hung open slightly, revealing teeth that had been ground down to nubs from years of jaw clenching caused by poorly calibrated stress response systems. The data port on the left side of her skull still had connectors plugged into it, trailing cables back to the workstation she'd been operating when she died. I stood there for longer than I should have, looking at this thing that was and was not my mother. The other workers flowing around me in their endless duties, the machinery grinding and roaring on all sides, the heat and the noise and the smell of promethium and metal all continuing as if nothing whatsoever had changed. Because nothing had changed. A servitor had failed. A new servitor would be assigned to that workstation. Production would continue. The machine that was the Imperium would grind forward without pause or recognition that something precious had been destroyed, because nothing is precious when measured against the scale at which that machine operates. The transport cart was a simple flatbed, with mag-locked wheels designed for moving heavy components through manufacturing corridors. I disconnected the cables from my mother's data port and lifted her body onto the cart. She weighed less than I expected. The augmentation had added maybe 20 kilograms of machinery, but her organic body had withered substantially, muscles atrophying and bones losing density because servitors aren't fed properly. Just given the minimum nutrition necessary to keep biological systems minimally functional. She felt like a bundle of sticks wrapped in skin, light and fragile, and somehow obscene in her fragility. The route to the recycling facility took me through 2 kilometers of manufacturing corridors, past assembly lines and storage depots and worker dormitories, where people slept in the narrow gaps between shifts. I pushed the cart with its burden, and nobody looked twice, because servitor corpses being transported to recycling was completely normal, happened dozens of times per day across the manufacturing complex. The mag-locked wheels hummed against the metal floor plates. My mother's body jostled slightly with each irregularity in the floor surface. Her dead eyes stared at the ceiling, seeing nothing, having seen nothing for 12 years even when they'd been functional. If carrying your mother's corpse to the recyclers is where your service leads, and you think the cost is too high, let your like be the prayer the Emperor never answered. Subscribe, so others might know what the Imperium's glory is built from. The recycling facility occupied a sub-level beneath the main manufactorum, a vast space filled with machinery designed to reduce failed servitors and other biological waste into component materials that could be repurposed. The organic matter went into corpse starch processes, ground into nutrient paste that would be fed to workers and partially converted servitors who still required biological nutrition. The mechanical augmentations were cleaned, refurbished, and sorted for reuse in future conversions. The remaining waste, bones and teeth and portions too damaged for any use, went into the promethium furnaces, where they were incinerated and their ashes were compressed into blocks that would be used as filler material in Rockcrete production. I delivered her to Processing Station 14. A tech thrall scanned the work order, verified the servitor designation, and logged the receipt. "Place unit on intake conveyor," he said without looking at me. The intake conveyor was a wide belt of reinforced rubber that carried failed servitors into the processing machinery. 3 other bodies were already on it, moving slowly toward the grinders and separators that would disassemble them into useful components. I lifted my mother's body off the transport cart and placed her on the belt as gently as I could, though gentleness meant nothing anymore and never would again. She began moving away from me, carried by the conveyor toward the machinery that would render her into raw materials. I watched her go. Her augmented hand dangled off the edge of the belt, the precision tool implants where her fingers had been catching the light from the sodium lamps overhead. Her face, turned slightly to one side, still wore that empty expression that had replaced whatever she'd been. The belt carried her around a corner, and then she was gone from my sight, and that was the last time I saw any physical evidence that she'd ever existed. I returned to my regular duties, replaced a worn drive belt on Conveyor 7, recalibrated pressure sensors in Sector 12, performed routine maintenance on 3 servitors in Sector Gamma, including replacing the nutrient feed line on Servitor Unit L479 Kappa, the one that had been my father. The one that continued functioning without any awareness that the servitor it had sometimes worked near had been his wife, that the maintenance worker servicing its systems had been his son, that any of this meant anything at all. The years after my mother's recycling were a strange kind of blur. I continued growing, my body reaching its adult dimensions through the combination of genetic potential and the harsh conditions that shaped everyone who survived to adulthood in the manufactorums. I was tall but thin, built from cable rather than bulk, my muscles designed for endurance rather than strength. My face acquired scars from flying metal fragments and casual violence from overseers who preferred physical correction to verbal instruction. My lungs developed a permanent wheeze that comes from breathing particulate heavy air for decades. My hands became tools themselves, calloused and scarred and shaped by the work they performed until they looked barely human. I advanced through the maintenance hierarchy with steady efficiency. By 18, I was certified for intermediate repairs. By 20, I'd been elevated to senior maintenance technician, which meant I could work on complex machinery and perform invasive servitor repairs without direct oversight. By 22, I was supervising younger workers, teaching them the same skills and rituals I'd learned, watching them develop the same psychological numbness I'd developed, because numbness was the only way to function in an environment designed to destroy anything soft or human. My father continued functioning throughout this period. His servitor body was more durable than my mother's had been, built for simple physical labor rather than precision work, and the mechanicus maintained him with reasonable diligence because loading servitors were valuable assets. I performed maintenance on him regularly, replaced hydraulic seals, cleaned control socket contacts, repaired locomotor systems, updated his behavioral programming when his efficiency metrics dropped below acceptable parameters. All standard procedures, all routine maintenance, all performed with the mechanical detachment I'd learned was necessary to survive. But sometimes while I worked on his augmented body, I would look at his face and try to remember what he'd looked like before the conversion. Try to remember the sound of his voice when he'd spoken my name. Try to remember any specific conversation we'd had, any moment of connection between us when I'd been a child and he'd been a human being rather than a piece of machinery wearing human flesh. Those memories were fading, eroded by time and the constant grinding reality of what he'd become. I could remember that I'd loved him, but I couldn't remember why. Could remember that he'd loved me, but couldn't remember what that had felt like. The tech priests said this was normal, healthy even. Attachment to servitor units based on their pre-conversion identities was counterproductive, interfered with proper maintenance practices, and created inefficiency in the workforce. The goal was to see servitors as what they were, biological machinery, rather than as what they'd been. My increasing inability to remember my father as a person was evidence of proper psychological adjustment. Proof that I was becoming a functional component of the system rather than a defective element that required correction. I suppose they were right. By age 25, I could perform invasive repairs on my father's servitor body without any emotional response whatsoever. Could open his cranial access port and adjust the control modules embedded in his brain tissue with the same clinical detachment I'd apply to calibrating a pressure sensor. Could watch him shamble through his endless duties without feeling anything except mild satisfaction that his maintenance schedule was current and his efficiency metrics were acceptable. Whatever he'd been had ceased to matter. Whatever I'd been had ceased to matter. We were both components in the machine now, shaped by it and serving it and finding meaning in nothing except our function, because function was all the machine permitted. The notification came during my 26th year. Servitor Unit L479 Kappa was being transferred to Sector 83 for hazardous environment operations. This was essentially a death sentence disguised as reassignment. Sector 83 was a waste reclamation zone where radioactive materials from reactor maintenance were temporarily stored before final processing. The radiation levels there were sufficient to kill unprotected humans within hours, and heavily augmented servitors within months. Loading servitors assigned to Sector 83 had average operational lifespans of 6 to 8 months before cumulative radiation damage caused terminal system failure. No explanation was provided for the transfer because none was required. Servitors were deployed according to operational requirements. Personal history and extended service duration weren't considered in deployment decisions. The Mechanicus needed loading servitors in Sector 83. Servitor Unit L479 Kappa met the specifications. Therefore, it would be transferred. Simple, efficient, completely logical in the context of a system that measured value exclusively through function. I received the notification 3 days before the scheduled transfer. Standard procedure. Maintenance personnel were informed of significant servitor redeployments, so they could update their service rosters and maintenance schedules. I read the notification, logged acknowledgement of receipt, and continued with my duties. There was nothing else to do. No appeals process. No mechanism for questioning deployment decisions. No recognition that the servitor being transferred to a slow death by radiation poisoning had been my father. That I'd spent 22 years watching him function as machinery, that his imminent destruction meant the last physical connection to my life before the orphan halls would be gone. I didn't visit him before the transfer. There would have been no point. He wouldn't have recognized me because he'd never recognized me, not once in 22 years of service. I would have stood there looking at him while he stared through me at nothing, and then they would have taken him away. And nothing about the interaction would have changed anything, or meant anything, or mattered to anyone except possibly me. And even that was questionable, because I'd been successfully conditioned not to care about things the machine didn't value caring about. They transported him to Sector 83 on schedule. I saw the logistics report. 15 loading servitors transferred, all assigned to waste handling duties in the hot zone, where radiation levels were sufficient to make the air glow faint blue in darkness. I imagined him there, shambling through toxic waste in an environment that was killing him by degrees, his organic tissues breaking down faster than the minimal maintenance protocols and hazardous zones could repair. His servitor body gradually failing as cells died and organs stopped functioning and the machinery bolted to his meat couldn't compensate anymore. He lasted 7 months, longer than average, which suggested his organic components had been unusually resilient, or perhaps the tech priests in Sector 83 had maintained him better than typical. The failure report listed cause of death as multi-system organ failure secondary to acute radiation syndrome. His body was rendered on-site rather than transported to the main recycling facility because the radiation levels it contained made transport inadvisable. They processed him into corpse starch in Sector 83's local recycling station, fed him to other workers and servitors in that sector, and then filed the termination report in the central maintenance database where it would be archived and forgotten. I read the report during my morning duty review, noted the termination, updated my maintenance roster to remove Servitor Unit L479 Kappa from my assigned units. And then I continued with my duties, because the manufacturer didn't stop functioning because a single servitor had died, and I'd been trained too thoroughly to allow personal considerations to interfere with productivity requirements. That night, alone in my HAB unit, I'd been allocated private quarters after my elevation to senior maintenance technician. I tried to remember my father's face, not the servitor's face, empty and augmented and inhuman, but his actual face from before the conversion. I couldn't. The image had been eroded by time and exposure to what he'd become, worn away like stone under running water, until nothing remained except the knowledge that something had once been there. I tried to remember his voice. Couldn't. Tried to remember any specific thing he'd said to me in the 4 years before they took him. Couldn't. The machine had consumed him so thoroughly that it had retroactively erased what he'd been, left me with nothing except the memory that I'd once had a father and that he'd been someone worth remembering. This is how the Imperium operates. Comment eternal if you understand that this cycle has repeated for 10,000 years and will continue until the species itself is extinct. I'm 34 years old now. I've been working in Manufacturum 7 Theta for 18 years, maintaining the machinery and servitors that keep production targets met and the machine god satisfied. I'm good at my job, extremely good. My efficiency ratings are consistently above 95th percentile, and I've been recommended twice for elevation to junior tech priest status, pending approval from the Forge Temple hierarchy. This would be a significant honor. Tech priests are ordained servants of the Omniseer, not merely functionaries. They receive extensive augmentation, partial integration with the machine spirits they serve, and authority over lower-ranked personnel. It's as close to escaping the grinding poverty of manufacturing existence as someone from my background can achieve. I'm considering refusing the recommendation, not for any noble reason, not because I object to the Mechanicus or their methods, or the system that ground my parents into corpse starch and expects me to be grateful for the opportunity to serve. I'm considering refusal because accepting would require me to become more like them, to willingly undergo augmentation that would begin the process of erasing whatever remains of my humanity. To take the first steps down a path that ends with me as another robed figure, performing servitor conversions on terrified people while explaining that their suffering is necessary for the greater function of the machine. But refusal carries risks. Tech priest candidates who decline elevation are viewed with suspicion. Their loyalty becomes questionable. They are monitored for signs of ideological deviation. And those who show deviation, who question the system or resist their assigned function, face correction. Sometimes that correction is additional conditioning and psychological adjustment. Sometimes it's reassignment to hazardous duty zones. Sometimes it's servitor conversion. Because the Mechanicus wastes nothing, and a person who's ideologically unreliable can still function perfectly well, once the portions of their brain responsible for independent thought have been removed or rewired. So I'll probably accept, take the augmentation, become a junior tech priest, begin my own transformation into something that isn't quite human anymore. And perhaps 20 years from now, some other orphan who grew up watching their parents function as servitors will perform maintenance on the machinery I've become. And they'll look at my face and try to remember what I looked like before I was converted. And they won't be able to remember either, because the machine erases everything eventually, consumes all of us regardless of whether we resist or comply or simply endure. The new orphans arrive regularly at Orphan Hall 17. I see them sometimes when maintenance duties take me past the residential complexes. Small children, most between 4 and 8 years old, their parents dead or converted or conscripted into the Guard and shipped off-world to die in wars they'll never understand. The children have that same lost expression I must have worn when I arrived 26 years ago. That look of someone who's been torn from everything familiar and dropped into a machine that doesn't care if they survive or not. The overseers process them with efficient brutality, assign bunks, issue work clothes, begin the conditioning that will transform them from children into workers, from individuals into components, from people into functions. Sometimes I wonder which of them will end up performing maintenance on their parents' servitor bodies. Which ones will spend years watching the people who raised them shamble through endless duties with empty eyes and mechanical precision? Which ones will eventually transport their parents' corpses to the recycling facility and then return to work as if nothing significant had occurred? The mathematics suggest most of them. On Forge World Metallica, approximately 40% of the population are servitors. Most servitor conversions are punitive, drawn from populations who've committed crimes or failed to meet production quotas or otherwise deviated from acceptable parameters. Most workers have children before their conversion or conscription. Therefore, most orphans will see their parents converted. Therefore, most orphans will eventually work alongside servitors wearing their parents' faces. It's an efficient system, brutally efficient. The children learn from direct experience what happens to those who fail or deviate or resist. They learn that individual lives mean nothing, that family bonds mean nothing, that the only thing that matters is function and continued service. They learn to see servitors as machinery rather than as mutilated people, because seeing them as people would make the system unbearable, and the system cannot afford to be unbearable because it needs workers who will continue functioning regardless of what horrors they witness or participate in. I used to think there was something we could do, some way to resist or escape, or at least refuse to participate in our own destruction. I was young. I didn't understand yet that the machine is too large to resist, too pervasive to escape, and refusal to participate just means you'll be converted and forced to participate anyway. Except you won't be conscious of it anymore because they'll have removed the portions of your brain that object to what your body is being used for. The machine god is not benevolent. The emperor does not protect. The Imperium is not glorious. These are the truths I've learned from 26 years of watching human beings be rendered into components and reformed into tools. The machine god is the machine itself, vast and grinding and indifferent, consuming everything fed into it and producing only more consumption. The emperor, if he exists at all and isn't simply a corpse rotting on a throne while his empire commits atrocities in his name, has never once intervened to prevent the endless brutality performed by those claiming to serve him. And the Imperium's glory is built from mountains of corpses and rivers of suffering so vast that measuring them becomes meaningless because human cognition isn't designed to comprehend horror at that scale. But I continue serving. We all continue serving. Because the alternative is conversion, and conversion means you serve anyway, except you don't get to be conscious of your objections anymore. So we function. We maintain the machinery. We perform our duties. We teach the next generation to do the same. And the machine grinds forward, consuming humanity by increments, transforming people into components and then grinding those components into dust, and will continue doing so until the species itself is exhausted or the machine finally breaks under its own weight. My mother has been corpse starch for 8 years now, consumed by workers who never knew she existed, converted into energy and protein that powered them through their shifts before being excreted and processed, and eventually incinerated and compressed into blocks that now form part of the walls in some hab unit somewhere. My father has been corpse starch for 7 years, fed to workers in Sector 83 before they too died and were recycled and fed to others in an endless cycle of consumption that doesn't even rise to the level of tragedy, because tragedy requires acknowledgement that something valuable was lost. I am still alive, still human, or at least something that passes for human. Still capable of remembering that I once had parents, even if I can no longer remember what they looked like or what their voices sounded like or any specific moment of connection we shared. Still capable of understanding that what happened to them was wrong, even if I can't articulate why it was wrong in terms that the system would recognize as valid. Still capable of caring that it was wrong, even if caring doesn't change anything, and probably makes my life harder because caring about things the machine doesn't value is inefficient, and efficiency is the only virtue the machine recognizes. But caring is all I have left. The only thing they haven't successfully conditioned out of me. The only fragment of whatever I was before the orphan halls that survived the grinding transformation into what I am now. So I carry it with me, this useless caring, this vestigial humanity, this fragment of consciousness that recognizes horror as horror rather than as necessary function. I carry it even though it serves no purpose, even though it makes nothing better, even though it will die with me and change nothing about how the machine operates. I carry it because my parents deserve to be remembered as people rather than as machinery, because their suffering should mean something to someone, even if that someone is only me, because refusing to forget is the only form of resistance available to those of us who've been successfully ground into components but somehow retained enough consciousness to recognize what's been done to us. If any part of this story has moved you, if you recognize even a fragment of this horror in your own world, then let your engagement be the memorial they never received. Subscribe to ensure this testimony endures beyond my inevitable conversion. Comment your location so others across the Imperium might know they're not alone in understanding what service actually costs. Like this if you believe they deserved better, even knowing better was never possible in a system designed from its foundation to consume everything and acknowledge nothing. I'll continue functioning in Manufactorum 7 Theta until the day I'm assigned to hazardous duties and die from exposure, or until I commit some infraction and they convert me into a servitor, or until I accept the tech priest elevation and begin my own transformation into machinery that wears human shape but contains nothing human. The new orphans will arrive, the servitors will continue functioning, the manufactorums will continue producing, and the machine will grind forward, consuming humanity in service to an Imperium that calls this holy, and an emperor who will never answer our prayers, because prayers aren't answered in a universe this fundamentally hostile to anything resembling mercy. This is what it means to grow up on a world where your parents are servitors. This is what it costs to be born in the Imperium of Man. This is the reality beneath the propaganda and the hymns and the claims of necessary sacrifice. We are fuel for a machine that will burn us all eventually, and the only choice we have is whether to understand what's happening to us or to be successfully conditioned into believing our consumption is glorious. I chose understanding. It has not made me free, but it has made me human, for whatever that's worth in a universe where humanity is a liability and function is the only virtue. I remember my parents. I remember their names, Davin and Azel. I remember they loved me. I remember they tried to save me. I remember the Imperium destroyed them and then forced me to maintain the machinery they'd become. This is my testimony. This is my witness. This is the only resistance I can offer against a system designed to ensure resistance is impossible. Remember their names. Remember what was done to them. Remember that every servitor you see was someone's child, someone's parent, someone's beloved, before the machine consumed them and reformatted their flesh into tools. Remember, even if remembering changes nothing. Because forgetting is what the machine wants, and after everything else they've taken from me, I will not give them that. The Emperor does not protect, but we remember anyway. It's all we have left.